My HOA president called the cops on my cabin, claiming a drug lab, but the truth was a federal fugitive, her own crimes exposed by my hidden cameras. The blue and red lights were flashing across my cabin windows when I pulled into the gravel driveway at Pine Ridge Lake. Deputy Martinez had his weapon drawn, sweating in the August heat as he crouched behind his patrol car. 3 more squad cars lined the private road, and there, standing in her bedazzled HOA president shirt and neon pink running shoes, was Margaret Sinclair, the woman who had made my life a living nightmare for the past 2 years. She was gesturing wildly at my cabin, her voice carrying across the humid air with a shrill intensity. "I'm telling you, officer, there's definitely someone dangerous in there. I saw shadows moving around and that vehicle hasn't moved in 3 weeks. This is clearly a drug operation, or worse." She clutched her rhinestone-covered phone like it was a weapon, ready to document everything for the Pine Ridge Lake Community Facebook page. What Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly known in her zealous pursuit of HOA violations, was that the person inside my cabin wasn't me, and he wasn't just some random squatter either. The man currently eating my frozen pizza and watching my 65-inch TV was about to make this situation far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. 3 weeks earlier, I had driven up to my lakeside cabin for what was supposed to be a month-long retreat. As an IT consultant who worked remotely, I needed these breaks from civilization. No emails, no Zoom calls, no clients asking why they couldn't print when their printer wasn't plugged in. Just me, my fishing gear, and a freezer stocked with enough microwave burritos to survive a nuclear winter. But then my biggest client had a server meltdown that required my immediate attention. The kind of emergency that pays for 6 months of mortgage but requires you to drop everything and drive back to the city. I'd left in such a hurry that I forgot to tell anyone I was leaving early. Why would I? It was my property, my business, and definitely not something that required Margaret Sinclair's approval. Margaret had been the HOA president for 18 months, having won the position when her only opponent mysteriously withdrew after Margaret discovered he had painted his mailbox the wrong shade of forest green. Since then, she'd turned our peaceful lake community into her personal kingdom. I'd received 17 violation notices in the past year alone. My crimes included having curtains that were too modern for the rustic aesthetic, parking my car at a disruptive angle, and my personal favorite, excessive quietness that suggests antisocial behavior. During my absence, Margaret's surveillance of my property had intensified to stalker levels. She'd started by noting that my Jeep Cherokee hadn't moved, which she documented with time-stamped photos every single day. Then she began peering through my windows with high-powered binoculars she claimed were for bird watching, though everyone knew the only birds she watched were the ones that dared to nest in unapproved locations. After a week, she'd seen the automatic lights flicker on, triggered by what was probably a raccoon, but what she insisted was suspicious activity. By week 2, she was measuring the grass height with an actual ruler, taking photos of my supposedly abandoned property, and posting increasingly dramatic updates on social media. Her Facebook posts had evolved from concern to hysterical. Day 12. The abandoned property continues to deteriorate, she wrote under a photo of my perfectly normal cabin. I fear for our children's safety. What if vagrants have moved in? What if it's a drug lab? I've noticed strange smoke patterns from the chimney that could indicate illegal chemical production. The smoke was from my automatic timer-controlled heating system, but Margaret had already decided on her narrative. She'd even called a special HOA meeting to discuss having my property condemned for suspected criminal activity and aesthetic violations that threatened property values. Deputy Martinez lowered his weapon slightly as more backup arrived. Margaret was now showing the officer screenshots from her tablet, each one supposedly proving her case. Look at this timestamp, 2:14 a.m. Lights on in the kitchen. No honest person is awake at that hour. That's when I saw him through the window. A man I didn't recognize wearing my bathrobe and holding what looked distinctly like a handgun. My blood ran cold. This wasn't some misunderstanding or Margaret's imagination running wild. Someone had actually broken into my cabin. That's my property, I called out, walking toward the deputies with my hands visible. I'm Clint Morrison. I own this cabin. Margaret spun around, her face cycling through surprise, disappointment, and then settling on indignation. You abandoned this property. I documented everything. You can't just leave for weeks without informing the HOA board. Deputy Martinez ignored her, focusing on me instead. Sir, do you know who might be inside your residence? Before I could answer, the front door opened slowly. The man standing there looked like he'd been living rough for weeks. Unshaven, wearing my clothes, and yes, definitely holding a Glock 19. What happened next occurred in slow motion. The deputies shouted commands, the man dropped the weapon and raised his hands. And Margaret, in her infinite wisdom, decided this was the perfect moment to rush forward with her phone to get a better video angle. Margaret, get back. Deputy Martinez shouted, but she was already halfway up my porch steps, live streaming to Facebook and narrating like a discount news anchor. "This is Margaret Sinclair, HOA president, bringing you exclusive footage of the drug bust I personally initiated through my vigilant neighborhood watching. The man they pulled out of my cabin in handcuffs wasn't a drug dealer or a random vagrant. His name was Vincent Torres, and as we would all learn within the hour, he was wanted by the FBI in connection with a multi-state fraud operation. He'd been hiding out in what he thought was an abandoned cabin, living off my food supplies, and using my laptop to create fake passports. But here's where Margaret's interference became more than just annoying. In her zealousness to prove criminal activity, she'd actually entered my cabin multiple times over the past week. She'd moved evidence, touched surfaces, and contaminated what would have been a clean crime scene. The federal agents who arrived 2 hours later were not amused. "You entered the property when?" Agent Robinson asked Margaret for the third time, his notepad filled with increasingly damaging admissions. "Well, I had to verify my suspicions," Margaret said with a defensive tone. "As HOA president, I have a duty to investigate suspicious activities." "You have exactly zero legal authority to enter private property," Agent Robinson replied. "In fact, you've compromised a federal investigation and committed breaking and entering." I pulled out my phone and connected it to my laptop. "I have something you might want to see," I told the agents. Over the past year, I'd installed trail cameras around my property, mostly to catch the wildlife, but also because Margaret's harassment had been escalating. The footage was all backed up to the cloud, time-stamped and crystal clear. The first video showed Margaret using a bobby pin to pick my gate lock 4 days after I'd left. The second showed her entering my cabin through the back door, which I'd stupidly left unlocked. The third, fourth, and fifth video showed her returning multiple times, rifling through my mail, photographing my personal items, and in one particularly damning clip, sitting on my couch and eating my ice cream while scrolling through my coffee table books. Agent Robinson's expression grew darker with each video. Deputy Martinez looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground, and Margaret's face had gone from self-righteous pink to ghostly white. "That's not I was investigating," she stammered with a panicked tone. "You were trespassing," Agent Robinson corrected, multiple times. "And here," he pointed to the timestamp on the video where she was going through my desk drawers, "you're tampering with what became evidence in a federal case." The best part, the absolute chef's kiss of evidence, was the final video. It showed Margaret inside my cabin just 20 minutes before she called 911, rearranging my furniture to make it look more suspicious and then apparently thinking she was alone, flipping off my hidden camera while muttering something that looked distinctly like profanity. "I need my lawyer," Margaret said with a weak voice. "That would be advisable," Agent Robinson replied. The courtroom was packed 3 months later. Half of Pine Ridge Lake had shown up to watch Margaret Sinclair's comeuppance. She sat at the defendant's table in a conservative suit, a far cry from her usual bedazzled HOA attire. Her lawyer, a tired-looking public defender, had the expression of someone who knew they were fighting a losing battle. My attorney, whom I'd hired specifically because he had a reputation for being ruthless with HOA cases, presented the evidence methodically. Every video, every Facebook post, every time-stamped photo that Margaret had taken thinking she was building a case against me now served as evidence against her. "Your Honor," my attorney said with a calm and measured tone, "the defendant entered my client's property illegally on 17 separate occasions. She tampered with evidence in a federal investigation. She filed false reports with law enforcement, and she used her position as HOA president to harass and defame my client across multiple social media platforms, causing measurable damage to his professional reputation." The federal prosecutor added their own charges related to the interference with Vincent Torres's capture. Apparently Margaret's contamination of the crime scene had made it harder to build their case against him, though they'd eventually managed to secure a plea deal. Margaret tried to testify in her own defense, claiming she was just being a concerned citizen, but the prosecutor destroyed her on cross-examination. Every HOA rule she cited they countered with actual law. Every justification she offered, they responded with video evidence of her breaking and entering. "Mrs. Sinclair," the prosecutor said with barely contained frustration, "you've admitted to entering the property multiple times. You've admitted to moving items inside the cabin. You've admitted to accessing private documents. At what point did you think any of this was legal?" "I'm the HOA president," Margaret replied with an indignant tone, as if that explained everything. "That gives you no legal authority whatsoever to commit breaking and entering," the judge interjected with a stern voice. The verdict was swift and brutal. Guilty on all counts: breaking and entering, filing false police reports, tampering with evidence, criminal trespass, and defamation. The judge seemed to take particular pleasure in delivering the sentence. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said with a grave tone, "you've shown a complete disregard for the law, for privacy, and for basic human decency. You've used your position in the HOA not to serve your community, but to terrorize it. Your actions could have resulted in someone being shot by police, and you severely compromised a federal investigation. Margaret stood there, her hands shaking as she gripped the table. I sentence you to 18 months in federal prison, 3 years probation, and restitution to Mr. Morrison in the amount of $75,000 for damages and legal fees. Additionally, you are hereby banned from serving in any HOA capacity for life. The gavel came down with a definitive bang. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, no sound coming out as the bailiff moved to take her into custody. Her bedazzled phone case glittered one last time as they confiscated it, and the woman who had terrorized Pine Ridge Lake with her clipboard and violation notices was led away in handcuffs. Her reign of HOA terror finally definitively ended,